Well, hello. Welcome back to another exciting edition of Coffee with Stephen. So, this week's blog was supposed to be about Judge Kavanaugh and his recent nomination to the Supreme Court. I had promised that last week when I got interrupted by news that a bunch of people I was asking about, so I had to comment on that. This week is no different. While I had written out the blog about Justice Kavanaugh, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the preliminary injunction in the case of Duncan v. Becerra. This immediately resulted in phone calls coming into the office saying, so now that the Ninth Circuit has ruled on behalf of gun owners, does this now mean we can go to our local gun store and purchase large capacity magazines? The answer to that obviously is no. The case of Duncan v. Becerra was not a case to legalize the possession of large capacity magazines. As I go through in the blog this week, it's already been legal. The law prohibits methods of acquisition, far different from possession. Now, Prop 63 was intended to criminalize the mere possession of magazines, and as a result, Duncan brought a suit against the Department of Justice in Duncan v. Becerra. Judge Benitez, down in San Diego, looked at the case and said, I am going to issue a preliminary injunction. There are two things that the judge needs to do in order to issue a preliminary injunction. Number one, there needs to be a belief on the part of the judge that the plaintiffs, in this case Duncan and the rest of us, would suffer an irreparable harm if the legislation were to go forward into law. Number two, they have to determine, or he has to determine, that in fact the plaintiffs, us, have a high probability of succeeding at trial. If those two things are met, then the judge can issue an injunction. That doesn't mean he overturns the law. What he does is he says, we're going to put the law on a timeout until we have our court case. That court case is probably going to take place this fall. So, typically speaking, whenever something like that takes place, the Department of Justice essentially says, okay, so be it. We'll go ahead and we'll wait till the court case comes around. Our particular Justice Department felt compelled to use your tax dollars to appeal that preliminary injunction. Again, not appeal the law. The law hasn't been litigated yet. Simply to appeal the preliminary injunction. They wanted to make sure that this magazine prohibition went into effect right now. So they appealed that to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The three-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals correctly looked at this and said to the Department of Justice, what are you here for? Reality is that you're about to have a trial in just a couple of months. Why are you essentially wasting our time by having us rule on a preliminary injunction, asking us to essentially overturn the judgment call of a lower court? We're simply not going to do that. So they ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and the preliminary injunction stands. Is this good for gun owners? Yes, absolutely it's good for gun owners. Is it a panacea and a massive benefit for us? No, not really. The reality is Justice Benitez very well could end up and probably will end up ruling that Duncan v. Becerra is in fact bad law, that Prop 63 should be overturned, and essentially declaring that that law is unconstitutional. That will immediately be appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals most likely is going to overturn Judge Benitez's decision in the actual trial. We then will end up appealing it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will hopefully have Justice Kavanaugh sitting on it. And ideally, at that point, the Supreme Court will hear the case and ultimately overturn the Ninth Circuit. So that is a good segue to next week when hopefully I'll be talking about Judge Kavanaugh. In any event, read the blog. I think you'll find it interesting. As always, if you have any questions, you can email me at stephen@artemishq.com. And as always, train constantly, train consistently, train with purpose. And above all else, stay safe and vigilant. Until next week, when we have coffee again together, thank you for joining me.